Hello. How's everyone doing today? I hope everyone's having a good Friday. We're back with Learner Series 4. Is it now? With deck building. With me today is Stronk again. Welcome, Stronk.
Hello.
Uh, this one's a pretty thick lesson today. I kind of think that we have a lot of content to fill an hour with, to be honest. We had a lot of questions from the server, a lot of people asking how to build decks, and I think this is really the series that people really want to read and learn about because building a deck is kind of how you play the game, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think deck building is going to be one of the hardest skills to master as well. So it can be a bit intimidating, I guess, getting into it for the first time.
Oh
But
yeah. I think I
um,
remember. I remember my first deck that I built. I think I explained this before. I literally took a dark Pokemon that I enjoyed. I think it was Hydreigon at the time. Built a deck around that and threw in a few other dark Pokemon and said, "This looks like a good deck." Ended up playing with somebody who had basically built a meta deck, and I just got stomped. And I was like, "I need to relook at how to build decks."
yeah.
So, but I think to start with, I think that's a good start for how to build decks, right? Is just looking at a card type, putting things together, and that's what we like to call synergy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think synergy is definitely all about looking for interactions between different cards that can work well together. And I mean, we see quite a lot of that in some of the meta decks that we looked at in the last series, but there's also a heap of other ones that are probably a bit less explored as well.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And I think that's going to be the main chunk of today's lesson is we're going to talk a lot about synergy, a lot about how decks work together and interacting, and really what goes into a meta deck and how what it looks like to have a deck that just runs really efficiently. So. As always, you guys can feel free to leave questions in the chat as we go through. We'll try to answer them as we go. We have a lot of questions from the Discord server that we'll try to also answer as we go through. A few of them are very interestingly specific. My favorite currently is, can we have a bit of insight into how to play the fossil Pokemon? So I'm looking forward to answering that question. So I guess we will get started. Uh, Hello. So let's really start with the start of a deck. You've got an idea and you want to build a deck, but you don't know where to start. And my recommendation, as I've always told people, is start with a card that you like, or maybe a card that just looks kind of cool and that you want to play with. Like, I think when I first got into it, I really liked Hydreigon and I really liked Hoopa, and I really liked the dark types. So I took a look at the pool of dark type Pokemon I had, and I said, I'll build a deck around Hydreigon, something like that. What about you? What's a good way of starting when you look at a deck?
Well, for me, I've always been looking at it, I guess, from a more meta perspective. So I would always look at a bunch of cards,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess look at things such as, I guess, what's the most effective? What can I get the most out of for like the least amount of investment? And I guess that sort of thinking is what I've been looking at mostly. And again, feeding back into the whole idea of playing with synergy, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that will have to do with how certain cards interact with each other.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the important part about looking at deck building is finding cards that work together. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the same type. We've seen decks that run multiple types, like the metal and fire decks, and colorless and steel decks, that kind of stuff. And I just said metal in two different ways. That's very strange to me. uh, so I guess where we look at is you can build a deck from the meta. You can build what's currently out there, and then if you want to go a little bit more freeforming and find a deck that you like. You could start with your favorite Pokemon. I've always told my 7-year-olds that find a deck you like and find a Pokemon you like and stick with it. But going outside of that, as you said, looking at cards in the card pool, I think you mentioned last series we talked about looking at the card pool, looking at the card list, and seeing what cards stick out as like the key or a signature card for that set, right?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the example that I gave was from Darkness Ablaze. Obviously, the poster boy of the set is Eternatus
Yeah.
VMAX, which is a very very beefy and very strong darkness type VMAX Pokemon. And in that same set, we also got a lot of very cheap single prize attackers that can help with its matchups against something like maybe like Summer's Enter V, Summer's Enter V, which is essentially immune to damage from Eternatus VMAX.
Right.
And there's also just straight up support for dark types in the form of something like Peers, which allows you to search for your darkness type Pokemon
Right.
in an energy card. And even there's an energy card itself in Hiding Darkness Energy, which not only provides a darkness energy, but also allows the Pokemon that has it attached to have no retreat cost.
Right.
So yeah, definitely like within a certain set, and certainly some of the signature cards in that set, there should be a few cards that interact quite well with each other, or you may have something that is really strong on its own and then have a few cards that help you build it up. Or there could be another instance where you have two different cards which may not necessarily be as strong on their own, but together they work out to become a really coherent strategy and very effective.
Right. So keeping an eye on what's coming, but also remembering just the staples that we've had before, and we'll talk a little bit more about staples because there's quite a few cards that we have that are staples now. But it's keeping an eye on what's in the pool, what's available to you in your tool set that can help you work out. We had a lot of those fire decks that existed back with Unbroken Bonds because we had Rushazard be really big, and we had Welder and Fire Crystal. But then later on, we also got the Flame Energy and I think Sword and Shield base. It was a special energy type that was very specific to fire types, and it kind of added to that pool of here's more fire support that can help out kind of thing. And then the same thing with metal Pokemon. We had Zacian and Metal Saucer come out in Sword Shield base to help out Ludicolo, uh, Lucario and Melmetal, Lucometal. I don't know where I got Ludicolo from. But it's that idea of like, sure, there's a lot of cards that'll help out in that one set, but hey, later on maybe we'll get more cards that can just add to that fuel of card pools that help out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great example of that is actually coming up very soon in Vivid Voltage.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had Pikachu and Zekrom GX, which has been pretty strong in the meta for a little while now. It's at least been present a little bit. It's kind of fallen off in recent times just because of developments with other decks and I guess other interactions and other synergistic combinations of cards. But with Vivid Voltage, they are releasing Pikachu VMAX as the poster boy of that set.
Right.
And with that, there'll be a whole bunch of lightning support. And although, in my personal opinion, Pikachu VMAX probably isn't the best card to use, it's all right, but it may not be the absolute best possibility. There's still lightning support in the set. For example, there's an Electro that allows you to attach 2 lightning energy directly from your deck, which might help with Pikachu and Zekrom GX in the case that it goes first and getting off that ever important full blitz.
Right.
That's kind of getting into like the more meta stuff, but I guess the main takeaway from what I'm trying to say is that even later on, you still would have to look at previous cards that are available, as you mentioned, to see if there's anything new that could help bolster an older strategy, as well as just looking within the newest sets and looking for the newest strategies that are available.
Right. Like we even had Vikavolt V in this current set actually, and that had a few bit of lightning support for it as well. Even though that set didn't really have a whole lot of lightning. support to begin with. It was kind of just, here's Vikavolt V that exists, enjoy that. So, and thinking back to building your own deck, there's a key thing to think about is that you want your deck to have a purpose. Putting together a bunch of cards that just work together is great, but you want to find a win condition, and that's a lot of the top players will actually talk about how their deck changes win conditions. Like it might be an aggro deck that really just goes for attacking, but later on they'll find a point where they can't attack. So then their next strategy is to maybe stall or mill their opponent to maybe get that win condition changed to having them just run out of cards entirely, or just have time run out at that point in a tournament. We've talked about IDing before, intentional drawing, but this is more of a strategy of saying like just stop them from playing or get them to not really do much so that you can just hold out until time gets called, kind of thing. And I think that's an important thing to think about when you're looking at cards, because you'll see a card that's like, your opponent has to spend 2 more energies to do an attack. That's a great way of stopping your opponent or stalling your opponent, because now they have to go and find extra energy to get attached to their Pokemon. Like for you, when you think about deck strategies, are you more of an aggro player, or do you feel that like a mill strategy is more fun to you?
Personally, I try and play a bit of everything, and especially when I'm trying to go for like points in that at a tournament, I'll just play, I guess, whatever feels like the best deck to me.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, though, I've in general been liking, I guess, some of the more control-esque decks
Right.
because they force me to think about the game in a different way, and it can get pretty complicated, especially like mirror matches and that,
Oh
where
yeah.
both of you have a lot of resources and you can recur those resources, but you're both trying to whittle each other down.
Yeah.
It can get pretty complicated in that case. But I also have my fair share of knowledge with aggressive decks. I think my 2 best finishes for the 2020 season, one was a very aggressive deck, which was based around Reshiram and Charizard GX and using Welder and attacking as quickly and as hard as possible using
Right.
Welder to get energy in play very fast to power up my stronger attacks faster. And then fast forward to the Oceania International Championships, I actually played Chinchino Mill,
Hmm.
where I essentially just wanted to run my opponent out of cards and not really attack and do any damage.
Right. Which both are really valid strategies too. A lot of players will employ the mill strategy. You might actually get a few players who might not enjoy that strategy though, because a lot of the mill, it's a control-y deck, and we get a lot of players coming from Magic the Gathering, so a lot of Pokemon players may not have actually heard of like what a control deck is, but in Magic the Gathering we see control decks as more of a deck that's, you're basically telling your opponent what they get to do, and that's it. Like they don't really have an option of what they get to do during their turn. In expanded, it gets a little bad with some dark types. I remember Portland regionals. A lot of dark boxes played that really control-y type, where essentially they whittled their opponent's hand down to 1 card, and then they would put a card on top, and they would make sure it's a useless card for their player, and then that player would draw a card and essentially have to pass because they A, didn't get a useful card to them, and B, they don't have anything else that they can do with their Pokemon at that time. So they pass, and then the opponent will just repeat that strategy, put a card on the top of their deck that's dumb, doesn't do anything, and kind of cycle through until the opponent has nothing left out of them. Um, versus the aggro strategy, like you said, where it's hit hard, hit fast, go as quickly as possible, because you want to end a game. Like Eternatus does that exact strategy. It's pretty fast. It aims to fill up your bench and go.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
so, so yeah. What about other win conditions that you think of? Because we talked about mill, we talked a little bit about aggro and stalling, and control actually.
Yeah, I guess I mean, as far as like the game rules are concerned, the only other real win condition, which hasn't really been, I guess, the focus of any kind of meta deck for quite a while, just I guess the way things have gone, is trying to knock out your opponent or get rid of your opponent's only Pokemon in play.
Mm.
So that you automatically win the game. Usually nowadays that win condition is more reserved for aggro decks that take advantage of an opponent who's getting maybe a bit of an unlucky start.
Right.
I can think of some decks from like years and years ago though, where I guess that was the primary win condition, but the formats back then are very, very different to what we see today.
Right.
In fact, I think the only thing I can think of is currently in expanded. There's a deck going around that tries to do that.
Right.
But yeah, so obviously you have, I guess, your main win conditions as far as winning via what the rules allow you to win by. But the next step is trying to find some sort of idea or strategy behind how you're actually going to
Implement
achieve
it.
that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess as you were saying, there's the aggro decks that try and hit really hard and hit really fast and try and overwhelm the opponent, as opposed to things like control decks that maybe take quite a bit longer, but ensure that you don't really have many options and they sacrifice, I guess, any kind of offensive pressure in order to do that. And I think you've got, I guess, two ends of the line there, and everything else sort of falls between in certain areas.
Right.
So even something like Dragapult VMAX, that deck's main win condition is to take all of its prizes. However, it generally takes a little bit longer to do so than, I guess, your standard aggressive deck,
Right.
because the damage output is less strong. However, the attack is quite cheap and easy to use, so you have more space for some more interesting cards and ideas that you can use to try and put enough damage on the board where your opponent is eventually overwhelmed, while also trying to, I guess, hold on and stall out and get through the offensive pressure of the much more aggressive decks.
Right. Yeah, and when you talk about alternative strategies, the one thing I can think of is like a card like I think it was Hoot Hoot from Sword Shield base. It had the carry off where it was just like take your opponent's active Pokemon and drop them into the deck and shuffle it. It was either active or one of its bench Pokemon, and it was a nice way to like get rid of some of their bench space and some of their Pokemon on bench, limiting their options of attacks, essentially. Um, and then mentioning Dragapult, um, the damage spread essentially is the deck type that we're looking at, archetype wise, and so like when within these different categories of deck types, you tend to find specific cards that help out. Dragapult has that horror energy. It used to have the spell tag. I don't know where my words are today. um,
Yeah. I don't think it was running necessarily spell tag as much, but it certainly had mysterious treasure, which helped quite a lot in getting it set up,
right.
because it's like an additional search card for it to use in order to get its key pieces into play.
Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of search cards, and those are kind of the key parts when we start talking about staples in a deck. You've got stuff like the quick balls. You've got cherish balls that used to be a really big thing when we were in CEC, Cosmic Eclipse, because a lot of your Pokemon were all GXs, so that cherish ball was just that easy. Here's a bunch of GXs, put them on your bench. And then tag whistles as well were giving you the tag team Pokemon. So there's those, but then you also have the really specific staples like Switch and Net and Net.
Scoop up net, yeah.
Scoop up Net. There you go. Jirachi. You've got Rare Candy. So it's important to kind of know that separation of, okay, I'm running a stage 2 deck. I'm gonna need rare candies because a stage 2 deck is extremely slow without rare candy involved. But then you've got Jirachi in some decks where it's like this is a way of getting items that you need, but you don't want that Jirachi just sitting in place, taking up a spot because it's an easy knockout for your opponent. So,
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly a distinction between staples as well. They tend to be, I guess, the more generically good cards like Quick Ball, which allows you to search your deck for any basic Pokemon. And obviously, your deck definitely has to run some amount of basic Pokemon
right.
in there as well. So pretty much every deck could play up to 4 copies of it and be pretty happy.
Yeah.
Um, even basic things like that, and maybe something like Professor's Research, which is just a generically good draw supporter where it doesn't matter what deck you're playing, anything can play this and discard their hand and draw 7 more cards.
Yeah, and that's never
And
left the
then it can
format
get to, I
too.
guess, more complicated stuff where you need more than one specific card, like Jirachi.
Right.
Jirachi is really good for getting trainer cards out of the deck, and it's very difficult to search for trainer cards
Mm-hmm.
usually. They typically come with a pretty significant drawback, like Green's Exploration, where Green's Exploration says you can't have any Pokemon with abilities in play.
Yep.
So Jirachi is one of the very few cards that doesn't have that big of a drawback. But you still need to play additional cards for it to work, such as Switch to get it out of the active position, because using its ability to get trainer cards out of your deck will put it to sleep, and it can be a bit awkward to try and get the Jirachi out of that spot when it's asleep since you can't retreat.
Right.
And then it turns out Switch is a pretty good generic staple, especially thinking about cards like Boss's Orders and things like that. When people try and bring up one of your Pokemon that you don't want active and try and get it to sit there while they buy some time to set up what they've got.
Yeah.
There's things like Switch. There's cards like Scoop Up Net, which I think low key is pretty insane, overpowered card. But
Right.
you can use Scoop Up Net to get Jirachi back into your hand. And there are other things that can take advantage of Scoop Up Net as well, like Galarian Zigzagoon, which just puts a free damage counter on one of your opponent's Pokemon.
Yeah.
But I guess circling back to the idea of your staples, there are things as simple as, I'll play 4 quick balls so I can search on my basic Pokemon, to things that are a bit more complex, like Rare Candy, where it's more for a specific kind of deck, but generically good for anything within that sort of deck, like with anything stage 2 can take advantage of Rare Candy, for example.
Right.
And then things that take multiple cards for it to work quite well, such as Jirachi plus Switch plus Scoop Up Net in some combination.
And you can even look at like Rare Candy being just as complex of a deck as like a Jirachi deck with Switch and Net, because in order for Rare Candy to work, you have to also have the stage 2 in your hand, which means that Quick Ball's not going to help you out there. Instead, you have to look for a different card that will help you out. So it's kind of this interesting combo of, okay, get the Rare Candy, get the stage 2, play them all at once, and now you've got your stage 2 out. But it's a matter of getting that into your hand altogether, because again, like you said, searching trainers is not an easy task. There's only a few cards that let you do it. We have like Skyla, and we have Jirachi, and we have Green's Exploration, like you mentioned. So it's a tough task to balance out what you get, and I think that comes to the really big question: is how do you determine how much of what supporter or trainer or tool do you put in your deck? For me personally, I've always looked at it as, if I'm putting in 4 of a card, it's an absolute need to have first turn kind of thing. And if I'm putting 1 or 2 in, it's more of a tech and more of me saying, I could use this in a certain strategy, but I may not. But then there's also the choice of using that limitation based off of how many times are you actually theoretically going to use it in a deck. Like if I'm running that Rare Candy and I've got a 3-1-3 line of stage 2s, I'm probably only theoretically going to use it 2 or 3 times. So I won't stack it with 4 of the Rare Candies. I might just put like 3 of them in, or 2, so that I can use that space for other things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where deck building gets really, really hard. And certainly it's something, I guess, that I could certainly improve on as well,
Uh-huh.
if I'm trying to become an even better player. Obviously, I still have that basic understanding, maybe a little bit more of a complex understanding of
Right.
deck building in that. But it's one of those things where, in fact, I was talking to other top players in the lead up to today's series
Mm-hmm.
about deck building, what they think about it. And one of the general consensus I was able to get is that it's probably the hardest skill in the entire game,
Oh yeah.
because if you want to get really, really good at deck building, you kind of have to have an understanding of how to actually play within the game as well.
Right.
As you were mentioning before, things like playing 4 of a certain card because you absolutely need to see it, or it's essential to your deck strategy throughout the entire game. For example, something like Welder is generally played at 4 copies,
Yeah.
versus cards that are played at just 1 or 2 copies because they're soft text.
Yeah.
It gets even more complicated than that. Like in your example, you were talking about playing Rare Candy with a 3-1-3 evolution line, so 3 basics, 1 stage 1, and 3 stage 2s.
Yep.
And you were talking about playing less Rare Candy in that. And as I was listening to you saying that, I was actually thinking, well, it might actually still be good to play 4 Rare Candy, even though you only have 3 stage 2s, because you absolutely definitely need to see that Rare Candy as much as possible, even though you could only use up to 3 in a game. If you don't see that Rare Candy, you're forced to go through and find that stage 1 to keep, I guess, more or less on the same tempo as if you don't have the Rare Candy.
Right.
So there's things like that. And there's also things as well, like I guess more recently, I believe yesterday or maybe this morning for you guys, it was very recently announced that I guess one of the cards in Standard that was added to the banned card list is coming back with a completely revamped effect. And as I was brainstorming ways for how I would use this card, I was thinking about it in a deck that would take advantage of it on the very first turn of the game.
Right.
But even then, I was thinking about only playing maybe 2 copies of it because it's searchable off of another card, and I would play max copies of that card instead, because past the first turn, I don't think it's that good to use, but I definitely want to see it on the first turn. So I still play a couple of copies just in case things as well, like if I prize it, for example.
Yeah.
So like, as you can see, there's a lot of things that you have to consider, like your likelihood of drawing it, how often you're going to play it during a game, how necessary it is towards your
goal
deck strategy, things like that.
Yeah, I think it's probably the most complex portion is trying to determine how many cards do I need. I've seen different tactics from like one of my friends. Actually, she goes through her decks and she'll actually percentage out how often she's gonna see a card on first turn versus how often she might see it on like the third or fourth turn. Because you might think of a deck as like, well, I need these very specific cards on my first turn in order for my strategy to really go out. And so you want to kind of look at that percentage of probability of saying, okay, what is it likely that I'm going to get this one card on my first turn? Or what am I looking at if I'm on turn 3? What kind of cards could I see? And so people start predicting that. But on the other side, I've seen just players just straight out play thousands of games with the deck. And as they do that, they quietly tweak like a card or 2 here or there because they notice I'm seeing too many of this one card that I just don't need at the time. So maybe if I drop 1 and put in a different card that I might need to see more often, I can tweak it. And that's where you start seeing a lot of the top players. They start talking about, I spent thousands of hours testing this deck, and I've spent multiple, testing sessions with other players on this deck. And I find it like I don't have a lot of free time to do that, so I like the math strategy, but I feel like playing a deck repeatedly is a really great way of just piloting almost automatically, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's certainly something that I try to focus on as well, is playing a lot of games with the deck, because at the same time I also learn about maybe some of the deck's matchups and what to do in certain situations.
Yeah.
I think the idea behind math is pretty good, as certainly as well in certain decks. I think that would actually be the preferred way of doing things. However, I think at the moment there's certainly more merit in, I guess, in general, looking at things by testing the deck out for yourself and seeing what you like and what you don't necessarily like. The aspect about, I guess, the math side of things is really good. Like maybe if you're calculating your chances of getting a certain trainer card on the first turn, and then trying to taking into consideration things like Jirachi to search it as well. That's all well and good. However, there are also times where the gameplay situation might be a little bit complicated. You might have to play in a little bit of an unusual manner, or maybe you have to change the order of the way you do things because either you want to keep your options open or you
Right.
absolutely desperately need a particular card.
Yeah.
So you play cards in a certain manner to increase your likelihood of getting that, as opposed to maybe doing something else where getting a certain card isn't as likely, but you're leaving your options open to get a wider range of cards.
Right.
So again, it comes down to it being pretty complex sort of area and getting a bit nitty gritty as well.
Yeah.
And it's just something really that comes with a bit of experience.
Yeah, and piloting is the important thing. If you know how to pilot your deck, you can handle it in a lot of situations and be very comfortable working out different deck types. Like if you play against a lot of Eternatus deck with your Decidueye deck, you might get very comfortable playing against it and like easy to pilot. But then suddenly your opponent's a different opponent altogether, like an Inteleon deck. Then you have to think of different strategies to work around because you can't just use the same strategy as an Eternatus since Inteleon's not running all V Maxes or all V Pokemon. It might be using just regular basic Pokemon to attack with you. That kind of strategy. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like a lot of players employ different strategies to do that. And I've lost my question. I think proportionizing that deck is really just a matter. It almost comes down to preference. Almost if you like, I probably am wrong about that, but I feel like preference comes into it.
I think in theory it also comes down to like you have like a finite card pool, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously there are only however many possible options of like a starting hand, for example. So in theory, there's like a best combination of cards, but
Right.
to actually go through and work all of that out, it's not particularly,
Right.
it's not really feasible. It's pretty much impossible, especially when they keep adding cards to the pool
Yeah.
every so often.
Yeah.
So certainly preference can come into play there, and it even goes back into, I guess, like the meta, including like your local meta, for example.
Right.
So I think the example I gave last week is I know in the US, from what I can see, a lot of people are quick to jump onto whatever the best deck is or what the best deck is considered to be.
Yeah.
And so the decks that tend to do well from that are decks that might counter that deck or have a good matchup against that deck,
Right.
or even a step further, decks that have a good matchup against those decks that have a good matchup against what's considered to be the best deck. Whereas where I am over here, a lot of people, I guess, they prefer, I guess, maybe the bit more of like an underdog sort of thing. So they
Mm.
prefer the decks that aren't considered as good, but they might have a good matchup against the best deck because I guess for us that's just considered more exciting. So even though you could be playing the best deck possible, in theory you might have another deck that you just can't necessarily beat. You don't really have a counter for, even though you're playing the best possible deck, just because it's not really possible to beat every single deck
Right.
with
Oh yeah.
one deck. So usually the Pokemon company jumps in and starts banning things, which is generally not a good sign, but it's
Right.
very rare that that happens. But even though you may have the best deck, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is it may not be good in every single situation. So there are things like certain techs and preference choices you make. Maybe you play four of this card and three of this card, while someone else plays three of that first card and four of another instead.
Right.
Um, Again, it comes down to a lot of factors, just like what you feel comfortable with, maybe what decks you're expecting to see, like at your locals or at a certain tournament and things like that.
Yeah. I think that's really kind of key is knowing what your local scene is like or knowing who you're going to be up against at tournaments. If you're going against a local tournament, you might know that hey, most of your players actually play Eternatus, or you might want to be prepared because maybe your local just likes to play different decks just to throw it out. We have a few local players who are considered the top players and they're always talking about best deck and format and they like talk about very predictable decks like Eternatus coming out. But at our last tournament, they actually threw out a completely different deck. They did not go Eternatus whatsoever. They went with, I think it was Decidueye, and they kind of play out that matchmaking theory of like, oh, they're gonna expect me to play this deck. What if I come out with this deck instead? Kind of thing. And I think it's a mind game kind of thing to play when you go to a tournament. I think that's talking more about competitive level and not really about deck building, but it's kind of an interesting notion to think about is that people talk about best deck and format, but people aren't playing best deck and format. They're playing the second tier deck and format instead. So I think that kind of covers really like rationing out. There's not a solid answer, and I wish that I could just say it's a 30-20-10. That's how you determine how your deck is supposed to fit. But there's not really an easy answer to answer that question of like rationing out. It's really all about what type of deck you run, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like going back to, I guess, my own examples, those two tournaments where I placed fairly well at, that Reshiram and Charizard GX deck, if I recall, played something like 17 Pokemon and 18 Energy, whereas the other deck that I played, the Mill deck, only played 4 Energy.
Yeah.
And in both cases, it was the correct choice. I needed the 18 energy in the welder deck because I needed it to continue seeing energies for welder. And there
Right.
was a particular Pokemon in that deck that would take advantage of all the fire energy that I would have in my discard pile. So if I had lots of fire energy, it would be much stronger than if I had not as many.
Yeah.
Whereas with the mill deck, I only played 4 energy because I only needed to attack on occasion.
Yeah.
And all of the energy that I had, I would be able to get back if I needed to. So by having less energy, I could focus more on the trainer cards, for example, that would help get the rest of my mill strategy off.
Yeah. And I think we've even seen that with stuff like Doll Stall. That was a deck that I ran, and I know that a lot of my players nearby were like, "Oh, you're running Doll Stall." It ran, I think, a total of 2 energies, and they were both rainbow energies for the damage counter addition on the Pokemon. And you had Spirit Tomb, who just picked up damage and did damage off of that. It would love the rainbow energy, but literally everything else was either no energy attachment like the dolls, or you had like Munchlax, who didn't even have an attack. He had a ability and that was it. So it's really important to look at like what cards you have in your deck to determine that ratio to go through. I think I really want to move to this question, um, and I'm curious to see what you think first. Is what would you say about a fossil deck? Like, how would you? Because we don't see fossil decks in metas, and I've seen a few
Not
people
yet. I'm
play
working
meta,
on it.
right? I have a few friends who are very interested in dinosaurs. They love dinosaurs; it's their favorite. Um, but like, how do you make fossil decks work in a meta, and why do you think that they haven't really existed in metas? To be honest.
Yeah, fossils are a bit interesting in the TCG because the mechanic to get the fossils out keeps changing like every generation.
Right.
But at the moment, the main way to get out fossils, for those who don't know, is that there's a particular item card for the Sun and Moon era. That item card is called Mysterious Fossil.
Right.
And more recently, in Darkness Ablaze, we got a new one for the new fossil Pokemon that we have called Rare Fossil.
Yeah.
And effectively, they play in the same way where they're a trainer card when they're not in play, but you would play when you play it, it's considered a Pokemon.
Yeah.
And that part of it is really interesting because it means that as a trainer card, it would be searchable off cards like Green's Exploration.
Yeah.
But because it's not a Pokemon until it's in play, that means you can't search it off of cards like Quick Ball. So it actually becomes a little bit harder to get them out.
Right.
So to balance that, what they do is they make the fossil Pokemon that these fossil item cards that are basics, they make the evolution cards a bit stronger.
Yeah.
And I think the one that I'm looking at quite keenly is Omastar from Team Up. And that
Yes.
has an ability where if you have less Pokemon in play than your opponent can't play any item cards from their hand. And item cards are a very big part of nearly every deck, and it's certainly every meta deck at the moment.
Yeah.
So if you're able to get off Omastar and another Pokemon, for example, that can be quite potent.
Yeah.
But more in general with fossils, the main ways to get them out would be something like a Jirachi engine, or maybe a Green's Exploration engine, or even something like Bill's Analysis, which is, I guess, a little bit of a lesser known card, which can
Mm-hmm.
also search for trainers under the right circumstances.
Right.
To get out those basic fossil cards out as quickly as possible. And the fossils also have another mechanic where at any point in your turn, you can discard them from play. So if even like with the example with Omastar, if you have too many Pokemon in play, if you can get one Omastar out, you can still discard the other fossils if you
Right.
don't need them.
Yeah.
And because the fossils don't really do anything else except, I guess, exist to be evolved into one of the fossil Pokemon, that can be really good to get rid of things that are clogging up your bench, to put other Pokemon down if you need to, if you're playing like a different fossil Pokemon, for example.
Right.
Um, but I guess the main complication with fossil Pokemon is searching out those basics, because without them, you obviously can't go into the evolutions.
Right.
So I think the main way people have been playing it is either playing a trainer-based engine to get out those fossils, or in the case of mysterious fossil, unidentified fossil, there's a stadium card called Pokemon Research Lab.
Yes.
And what that lets you do is lets you search for two Pokemon that evolve from that fossil and play them straight to your bench. You don't need to have the
Mysterious
trainer fossil there. It lets
Yeah.
you just put them straight on there. But if you do so, your turn ends. So it's a little bit slower.
Yeah.
But that's another way of getting the fossil Pokemon out. It's pretty interesting because they have a unique way of coming into play,
Mm-hmm.
which makes it a little bit easier in some ways, but also a bit more difficult in other ways.
Right. I was actually going to mention the research lab, because that is that came out, and that was the my fossil players. That was their really go-to card, because on turn one, essentially, you can have the stage one out, because turn one you're not going to attack, so your turn already basically ends when you're done. So you could always get that last, grab those two Pokemon that you need, put them on your bench, and you're practically set up at that point. With it, you don't have to go through the waiting game of playing a unidentified fossil, waiting a turn to evolve it into the stage one, or even rare candy into the stage two. You just turn one, you get that card out, and you're ready to go. And I think that's kind of a nifty thing, especially with that set came with Stadium Nav. So it was, you even had better cards, because then you had a card that got the stadiums for you. It was just really luck based though. You had to flip a coin, two coins, and if you got a heads, you get to find a stadium card. So you had a little bit of control to go through. But like you mentioned, fossil cards lately, or fossil Pokemon lately, have had a lot of sort of almost OP effects, but they're hard to get through. Lately, we got the two cards. One that prevents your opponent from evolving. I think it was like Arctivish or Arctozolt. I get all four of those Pokemon totally confused, so I might be naming the wrong one.
Yeah, so do I. I think that specific one is Dracovish.
Dracovish,
But
yeah. And I think the
yeah,
other one was Arctovish or Arctozolt, that had the ability where if your opponent attaches energy, they take damage on that Pokemon for attaching energy, which on paper that looks really great, especially for a deck like a Reshazard deck where you're weldering on two energies and then attaching a third. That Pokemon now just takes 60 damage, I think it was, because I think it's 20 per. And you didn't do anything; your opponent did it all. So it kind of hurts the opponent for doing stuff like that. And then going back a few sets, we had a Cranidos that had an ability, or I think it was Cranidos or Era, one of the flying fossils that I'm totally spacing on. He had an attack that for like one energy, if your opponent's Pokemon wasn't a GX, you just knocked it out, or something similar of that nature. I should have done my research on this card, but it was really good, because it didn't do any damage. It didn't have a whole lot of requirements. It was just a stage two though, and it essentially just knocks out
in
Pokemon.
Rampardos.
What's that? Rampardos? Yeah, it might be Rampardos. I'd have to look it up for sure. But it had a great effect that was like you could just fly through your opponent's Pokemon as long as you met that criteria against them, kind of thing. So I think I think when you look at fossil Pokemon, it's an interesting tactic of, yeah, it's a stage 2, but you could be playing with some very powerful cards, and your opponent doesn't know what you're playing, because if you throw out an unidentified fossil, I could go for an Almastar, or I could be going for a Kabutops. So it kind of throws off your opponent a little bit with that one. Um, so I think we've gotten through a lot of deck building. We've talked a lot about rationing out. Um, the last question that we want to talk about is the synergy of some of the meta decks that currently exist. And I kind of want to have you talk about or grab a deck that's currently popular in the meta, and then talk about it, and we'll kind of back and forth about that deck and see what you think of that deck specifically. Because I think right now there is what, four top decks that are really running around.
I mean, if I were to play, I guess, a more meta deck at the moment, I think there would probably be about 5 or 6 decks that I would
Right.
want to at least be wary of or think are really strong.
Yeah.
But I guess if we're picking a meta deck, I think uh, the obvious pick at the moment would be ADP Zacian, since that's the one that's got everyone talking quite a lot.
Right. Yes. ADPZ, our favorite one. Let me pull up that deck list real quick so that I also have a list to look at as well. I guess we'll just use Limitless TCG for a list.
Yeah, if you go specifically to the Players' Cup finals and you scroll down to the list from Will Jenkins, I think his list there, it's not the best performing list for that tournament, but I think that's probably the closest to what people are playing nowadays.
Gotcha. See if I got the right. There we go. I was like, do I have the right source? All right. So we've got Will Jenkins' deck. Right now, it looks like it's running 4 Jirachi, 3 Zacian Vs, 2 ADPs, 2 Dedenes, and a Crobat. We've got a mix of about 38 trainers and 10 energies. Let's start with the obvious synergy between some of the cards that you see.
Yeah. So the main idea behind this deck is to look at the ADP or Arceus and Dialga and Palkia GX
Mm-hmm.
and the Zacian V. That's, I guess, like the baseline of the deck, what the deck in general tries to achieve.
Right.
So the primary concept behind it is taking advantage of this altered creation GX attack. And it's very unique because it has an effect that lasts for the entire game. Usually effects will only happen like immediately as like a one-off effect, or it might be only during your next turn or during the opponent's next turn, do this. But this effect is quite unique because it's for the entire game. So for as long as the game progresses, you and your opponent have to take into account the fact that this effect is in play. And this particular effect is quite strong because for the rest of the game, your attacks will do an extra 30 damage. But the key part that makes this deck so strong is that if you have an additional water energy attached on top of the metal energy that you need, every time you take a knockout from damaging your opponent with an attack, you take an additional prize card. And that is a super strong effect, especially right now.
Right.
And so when this card first came out, there wasn't really like a great pairing to put it with. And I think most people put it with the Keldeo GX.
Yeah, for the wall, basically.
Yeah, so Keldeo GX didn't really do as much damage, but it had an ability that gave it immunity to Pokemon GX at the time.
Right.
So it would eventually whittle it down and they would take extra prizes from that. However, when Sword and Shield came out, we got Zacian V, which is probably one of the best Pokemon that they've printed in quite a long time. It just does everything.
Right.
So the main idea is to use Zacian V's Brave Blade attack, which does 230 damage, which is insane.
Mm-hmm.
It does have a drawback where next turn this Pokemon can't attack, but we'll talk about how we get around that. Now, the attack costs metal energy, and if you'll remember, Arceus and Dialga and Palkia GX also requires metal energy for its attack. So it's not that much of a stretch to get Zacian V going. In fact, Arceus and Dialga Palkia GX's regular attack for an extra energy allows you to search your deck for up to 3 basic energy and attach them to your Pokemon however you want. So the main idea would be to try and get this GX attack off as soon as possible. And then if you're able to maintain your Arceus and Dialga and Palkia GX, you can just attach another energy and use Ultimate Ray, which does 150 damage, or after the GX attack 180, which is pretty solid.
Yeah, that's a
And
solid
then
one.
you also get to accelerate energy to your Zacian V.
Yeah.
Now, I guess in a more complicated um, sense, the reason why this deck is very good is because at the moment, a lot of decks rely on this Dedenne GX and this Crobat V to help them draw additional cards outside of their regular draw supporter. And you'll notice they have fairly low HP, or at least low enough for Zacian V to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at the trainers, it's probably a few things that may stick out as a bit weird. But the main idea is that on turn one, you want to attach a water energy to your Arceus and Dialga and Palkia GX, and then you want to get a metal energy into the discard pile. And there's a few ways you can do that. You can use Dedenne GX's DD change ability, where if you have a metal energy in hand, you'll have to discard it for that, and then you get to draw additional cards. You have cards like Quick Ball, where you have to discard a card from your hand. You have things like Professor's Research, which works similarly to Dedenne GX.
Right.
And once you get that metal energy in the discard, you want to use this Metal Saucer card here. And this is definitely an example of synergy between Zacian V and another card in the same set, because Metal Saucer will allow you to attach that metal energy that you discard to a bench metal Pokemon. And that bench metal Pokemon most likely will be Zacian V, but it could be Jirachi. And then the next step is to use its energy switch, which is why they play so many of it. And you use that energy switch to move that metal energy to your ADP. And then suddenly you have all of the energy to use Altered Creation GX and use its full effect on the very first turn of the game.
Yeah.
And typically nowadays, what will happen is once they've done that, they will try and use something like Boss's Orders or Pokemon Catcher to bring up a Dedenne GX or a Crobat V that you were sort of forced to bench in order to keep up. And they'll use something like Ultimate Ray or Bravely to knock it out, and then they get 3 prize cards for that. So they're already halfway towards winning. And then the turn after that, they'll try and do the same thing to another one and attack again and just win the game outright.
Right. So their aim is really to get things out quickly as possible, and they play a lot of those trainers and the support Pokemon, as we like to call them, the Dedenne and the Crobat, to really speed through that draw. As you mentioned, the Dedenne GX is great for that discard, so that you can get rid of the cards that you will pull back with something like Metal Saucer, and then the Zacian V kind of just accelerates that metal energy grab too, so you can also use Energy Switch, move them to Arceus, Dialga, Palkia, ADP, and just swing right out of the gate first turn, essentially.
Absolutely, and that's why when you look through the trainers and some of the Pokemon, you'll notice that there's quite a lot of cards. In fact, there's no card at 1 copy except for Crobat, because you generally prefer Dedenne in this deck because the discard can be helpful. But like looking through the trainers, you got like 4 Professor's Research, 4 Quick Ball, 4 Metal Saucer, 4 Energy Switch, 4 Switch. Like you got lots of 4-offs and plenty of 3-offs as well, because there are a few cards that you need to pull off that turn 1 combo to get that full effect from Altered Creation GX on the very first turn.
Yeah.
So that's why they play as many copies as possible, so they can try and see as many of those cards as they possibly can.
An additional thing to look at too is that they have very little amount of water energy, and you might notice that Arceus Dialga Palkia requires that water energy to pull off the Altered Creation and even Ultimate Ray. So again, adding in that Energy Spinner and the Turbo Patch, they're just that first like great way of just getting that really rare card that's in the deck, or even seeing if you have it. What really stops this deck would have been if the 2 water energy get prized. You don't have the ability to get that Altered Creation, the Ultimate Ray out. So then you have to rely on switching strategies and saying, all right, Zacian's going to be my first attacker. so I can make sure that I can get prizes pulled as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've certainly been in that situation where both of my water energy are in my prize cards, and then the game immediately after both of my Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia GX were in my prizes. That was a
Right.
bit unfortunate,
Right.
but that's pretty rare to happen.
Yeah. It is possible, and that's why decks usually will look at the strategy of working out. Okay, if my very important cards that I'm only running two of happen to go into the prize card, what are my backup strategies? What are my other options as far as win conditions go? And I think that like in this kind of deck, you have Zacian V in the back burner because obviously Crobat and Dedenne GX are not going to be attacking for you because both of them require energies that you just don't run. Um, so you have to look at your two attackers, which is Arceus and Zacian. And as you mentioned, Zacian for 3 energy, 230 is basically a knockout for almost any Pokemon that we've got currently, other than your big hitters like Eternatus kind of thing. Um, so I
Yeah, it pretty much takes out anything except VMAXs and certain tag teams. It still takes out a couple of them, which
yeah,
is just crazy.
yeah, 230 when that came out was just insane because that's more than its own HP, which is just wild to think about. To be honest, that it itself could knock out one of its own, essentially, with that attack.
Yeah, and on top of that as well, it's got like lots of HP and it's a basic Pokemon, so it's easy to bring out.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's got this Intrepid Sword ability, which I forgot to mention, which is also really good.
Right,
So the Intrepid Sword ability is an alternative to using an attack because it'll end your turn. So it's very good if you're going first.
right,
But what it allows you to do is you look at the top three cards of your deck, and if you see any metal energy cards there, you can go right ahead and attach them to Zacian V, regardless of your regular attachment for your turn. But then you get to keep the other cards. So even in my mill deck, for example, where I didn't play any metal energy, I actually played I think 3 copies of Zacian V just because I can use the Intrepid Sword ability when I'm not attacking, just to get the additional cards in my hand.
right.
Like it's just crazy like how much this one card can do.
Yeah,
But certainly in this deck, it can also take great advantage of the fact that it attaches additional energy.
yeah. It's a very flexible card, and I think that's one reason why it's an absolute must in a deck like this, just because of how flexible it can be, and it even fits in a lot of metal decks like Luco Metal could also run something like this as well for just the metal strategy on top of it, in addition to it. So, since we don't have a whole lot more time, I do want to talk about one other deck that might be kind of important learning synergy wise, and that would be, in your opinion, Luca Metal or Eternatus. I'll let you pick which ones you think is.
Uh, I, I think Eternatus would be the better option. Speaking to the player who won the Players' Cup with Luca Metalization, they were telling me that the deck probably isn't as strong anymore. So I think it has to be Eternatus. It's also just been doing like about as well as ADPization.
Right. Whose deck do you recommend, Aston or Alejandro's? Or is there a different person that you recommend?
Let's have a look. I would say probably Austin's one is all right. The deck's undergone a few changes since then, but
Right.
I mean that's kind of what you expect.
Yeah, exactly. As decks evolve, we play more games with them and we get to tweak them a little bit, and I think that's the important part about Pokemon, because we don't have a mechanic like Yu-Gi-Oh does with sideboards where we can just swap cards in as we want to. We have to play an entire match and say, okay, this did not work out very well. Let me change some cards after the tournament's over. So, all right. So looking at Eternatus, we can see a lot different alterations to this one versus what we saw with ADPZ. Um, we can see a lot more of the fours on the Pokemon. So we're looking at a lot more heavy Pokemon, but difference is that we have the Black Market Prism Star as a tech or a card in that deck. Limitation being though is because Black Market Prism Star is a Prism Star card, so we're only allowed to run one of it in the deck. for it. But again, it's a very top heavy deck with a lot of the 4s and 3s in the deck, and then we're running again 8 darkness energy and 2 capture energy. So this deck is slightly different in that it's not looking to quickly grab energy out. It's actually more looking at grabbing Pokemon and putting them out because of Eternatus VMAX's deck ability. With the Eternal Zone, if all your Pokemon are Dark type, you can have up to 8 Pokemon, which just adds to that Dread End attack. Because the Dread End is based on how many Pokemon that are Dark in play. So if you have a full bench of 8, you can do a max damage of, I think it came out to 240 math.
It should be 270 because it also counts your active
Oh,
Pokemon
true.
as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. So you actually technically have 9 Pokemon out there with Eternatus VMAX. So this deck is essentially running off the idea of, okay, grab Eternatus, evolve it to VMAX, and then just get out Galarian Zigzagoon, max out with Crobat Vs, the Hoopas, and you just have a full bench that just is ready to swing for Dread End. But on the backside, you also have a few of those tech cards like the Hoopa that we mentioned, because you've got Hoopa with the Assault Gate and Hoopa with the Evil Admonition and the Mind Shock. They might be supporting Dark Type for Eternatus VMAX, but they also are your alternative attackers in case maybe you knock out an Eternatus VMAX and your other 3 are in your prize cards for some weird reason, right?
Yeah, so I think the main thing to look at with this deck is, as you were mentioning, this deck has got quite a bit of Pokemon, like nearly around twice as much as the ADP's Asian deck. And that comes down to 2 things. One, it's obviously to try and maximize the amount of damage you can get off Dread End through Eternal Zone. But there's also another aspect of Eternal Zone which I don't think you quite touched on,
I
where
did not.
Eternal Zone prevents you from putting non-darkness type Pokemon into play once it's in play, which is why all of these Pokemon are darkness type.
Yeah.
So this deck would benefit quite a lot from Dedenne GX and Jirachi if it was allowed to play it under Eternal Zone. But because it's not, we have to resort to playing maximum copies of all these Pokemon, so like 4 Eternatus V and 4 Crobat V, especially because that's going to be your main way to draw cards outside of your supporter for the turn, and even things like 4 Galarian Zigzagoon. So I think this deck plays for a 14 basic Pokemon, which is a good amount to get Dread End going as quickly as possible. And then looking at the trainers, you can see that like there's even more 4-ofs in here because you have to draw less cards because you don't get access to Dedenne GX and Jirachi.
Right.
So we play 4 copies of Marnie. I think they're going down on the boss's orders amounts more recently and maxing out on Professor's Research.
Right.
And even like your search cards like Quick Ball and Great Ball and Pokemon Communication tend to be going up a bit as well.
Yeah.
I think Turbo Patch is not being played as much now. Scoop Up Net is still around. That's mainly to reuse your Galarian Zigzagoon and get extra damage into play for free,
Yeah.
especially for the VMAXs. While Eternatus VMAX does hit extremely hard for very little, it isn't quite enough to take down VMAXs. So we use Galarian Zigzagoon to try and get extra damage on the board to, I guess, patch up that little bit of a gap.
Yeah. It's kind of like our... Sorry.
It also uses cards like Viridian Forest to search for the energy that it needs to actually power up the attack. Air Balloon, for example, is an interesting option for retreating. There are a couple of other options now. I think there's a Dark City and the Special Energy that was released in Darkness Ablaze as well. If you want to consider those.
Yeah.
The 2 things that are missing, I guess, from nowadays is a lot of people have moved away from the Hoopers as your basic non-V attackers. They are still quite strong, but one of the drawbacks to them is they're quite situational or a bit awkward to use. Like, for example, with the Darkness Ablaze Hooper, it requires it to be on the bench and then have moved to the active spot in the same turn, which can be a little bit difficult to do like over and over, especially against something like Decidueye, which can enjoy immunity from something like Eternatus VMAX's Dread End attack.
Yeah.
So that can be a little bit awkward to use. And something like Hooper from Unified Minds, that card is also very good, especially in the mirror match for its evil admonition attack. But if you're playing against someone who isn't playing Eternatus, for example, and they can see that Hooper coming, they can play around it a little bit and try and not have as many Pokemon with abilities in play.
Yep.
Then it ends up not being as effective as you may be hoping.
Yeah.
So what people are moving to instead is the Spirit Tomb in Unbroken Bond, which I think you were mentioning with Dolstall, where it doesn't necessarily do as much damage as the Hoopers in every situation, but it will consistently do that amount of damage no matter what the situation is. So it's a bit more consistent, it's a bit more reliable. Some people are still playing the Hoopers though, so they're definitely an option. But
Yeah.
Spirit Tomb is another consideration as well, especially for certain decks and certain meta decks, which we'll probably look at in the next series.
Yeah.
But yeah, the main takeaway is in this case, because you're kind of locked into darkness type Pokemon due to Eternal Zone, you really have to max out on your Crobat V in order to draw more cards, maxing out on your important basic Pokemon so you can see them more often. And nowadays they're maxing out on their draw supporters like 4 Marnie, 4 Professor's Research, and then also their search cards like 4 Quick Ball, 4 Great Ball, and I think I've even seen people play 4 Pokemon Communication as well.
Yeah. Just to get that Pokemon swap out. Um and another interesting key thing to notice is that ADPZ, it has a lot more of that discard where you're wanting to throw cards into the discard so that you can reuse them later on. This one seems to be more focused on kind of revolving your cards in the deck because you've got your Marnies where you can put things into the deck and pull them out later. You've also got Crobat V, which is just drawing cards. We didn't touch on it really, but Hide Energy is also in there as well as a dark type energy, so that you don't have to use Dark City instead. That was another card that I've heard used in Eternatus, but it relies on holding on to a lot of cards rather than discarding them and reusing them. And I think that's another strategy to look at.
Yeah, and in fact, nowadays as well, because they're a little bit more reliant on Crobat V as a draw engine, since they kind of have to be. They're even playing cards like Dangerous Drill, where you have to discard a Darkness Pokemon from your hand, but then you can get rid of I believe, Pokemon Tool or Special Energy.
Yeah.
That's in play. So they can use that to get rid of cards like Big Charm on an Arceus and Dialga and Palkia GX, which can be a little bit awkward for Eternatus to try and take a knockout on.
Yeah.
But they're also getting rid of certain darkness Pokemon in their hand that they may not necessarily need.
Yeah.
They're thinning down their hand a little bit so that way they can draw more cards with Crobat.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's another key point that we haven't actually touched on really is thinning out your hand. I think that'll probably be something that we'll talk a little bit more about in Series 6, where we talk about just strategies that you'll see a lot of players employ and work with, like thinning out hands and just doing that repetitive searching and just constantly going and looking, and even as far as just doing a search just so that you can see what's in your deck right off the bat. Like some players will just run a search card on their first turn even though they don't need it, so that they can just kind of see what's in their deck and make sure, okay, this is what I need to plan for. You'll see on some streams players will actually flip cards a little bit up so they remember, okay, I've got 2 Eternatus V Maxes in my deck, so that they're not later on going through and trying to search for an Eternatus V Max and realizing, oh man, where are my Eternatus V Maxes? Oh, that's right, I only had 3 in my deck because one of them got prized. So I think those strategies start coming into really into play at a much higher level of gameplay. When you look at like the cards in general, it's not just about being synergistic and saying, Hide Energy works really well with the dark Pokemon, and you can put that on Eternatus V Max so that he has free retreat and just having all the dark Pokemon kind of thing. It's also just looking at actual general strategies that you can employ to make sure that you're not making mistakes later in the game and you're not tripping yourself up, kind of thing. I think that's one of the big things that a lot of players really hit a roadblock to is that they'll play a deck, but they'll make those weird misplays and they'll realize I could have avoided this misplay if I was doing something different. Um, so I think that's something to really think about when it comes to this, when it comes to playing, which we'll get to later on. We probably have a really good Series 6 that we have planned, that we'll keep wrapped up for now.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
but yeah, so I think we've got most of the questions covered as far as deck building goes. Just the basics to deck building. We'll probably talk a little bit more about advanced deck building in series 5 next week. For sure, we'll cover a lot of the more very specific cards, the tech cards, as we mentioned in some of these decks. And we'll kind of go through just those really minor changes that you'll see some deck lists pull between cards. And we might even see even more decks come out now that Champion's Path is becoming legal too. So that'll be interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
So again, thank you, Strong, for coming on the series. I noticed that you like to promote the series too, so I can tell that you enjoy this series at least, though. That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I've been playing the game for, I think, about 10, 11 years now, and I can see that there's definitely a very clear divide between people who are, or I guess, a very big gap between people who are coming into the game to begin with and are looking to get into a more competitive sort of area or want to play a bit more competitively. And there's quite a bit of things to go through and understand in between all of that. And it can be a bit difficult as well. Like I was saying before, like with deck building, if you want to become a really good deck builder, you kind of need to understand how to play quite well as well. But then you need a deck in order to play and get experience and improve as a player, and then improve your deck building. So it can be a bit cyclical in that sense.
Right.
So yeah, I think having this series is really, really good because you're learning not only about very basic deck building concepts to get you through, but eventually you'll also be looking at things that you can look at within a game when you're in certain situations, what sort of ideas and strategies that you can use, I guess, in any situation, no matter the deck that you're playing, in order to improve your chances of winning and even just get a better understanding of, I guess, more complicated deck building concepts.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing too. Is complex deck building is, it's as the name suggests. It's complex. It's very complicated, and it takes a lot of thought process. Like I told you, my friend who does the math on her entire deck and comes up with win percentages. That's in itself is a lot of math and a lot of complexity. But for her, that just kind of comes second nature, and that's how she sees deck building. Is she sees it all about probability and percentages. And for anybody curious, that deck that she was building was the Gardevoir GX deck, or the Gardevoir Tag Team GX deck, that was really popular back a while ago. I think it was when that card actually came out. She loves fairy types, so that was the deck that she built. And I think that kind of ties right around to build a deck of cards that you really enjoy, with Pokemon that you really enjoy, and not just ADPZ is the meta, so let me hit ADPZ, even though I absolutely hate those Pokemon kind of thing. So, awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And even going back, I guess, to the mill deck that I was playing, even though ADPization was far and away the best deck in the format at the time, I still felt more comfortable playing the mill deck for that tournament, and so that's what I ended up playing. I don't think I would have done nearly as well as I ended up doing if I played ADPization.
Yeah. So, awesome. All right. Well, we've hit time. Again, appreciate you being on the show. I'm looking forward to our Series 5. I enjoy the talk, and I'm hoping that everyone is really starting to pick up a lot of information from these series and really like picking it up for later on. Oh, Siri, don't turn on, please. um, I'm actually kind of looking forward to seeing some new players out in IRL tournaments when we get there. Because I think that that's kind of important is that having more of those players in the game and enjoying the game is really what makes it more fun to like go to tournaments for. Even if you're not a perfect player or fully understanding of like deck building, I think that enjoying the game and enjoying actually playing with the cards is where uh, really where Pokemon kind of shines. It's there is the collecting aspect, but I feel like I don't know what you think, but like playing the game is just super fun for me. So
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
awesome. All right, well, we are gonna head out. Thanks again, guys, for being here. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for being on the show, Strong. And I guess we will see you guys next time. Peace.